Hi everybody! Today we're going to talk about trade and in particular tariffs, something that's in the news a lot and something I thought we should go over in more detail. You will have read the chapter by now, chapter 16, so this is meant to hit the main points. You're also going to have a chance in discussions to talk about these issues, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. But let's start with why countries trade. A quick review. We went over some of this in chapters 1 and 2. Is countries trade based on something called comparative advantage. And this concept, that was the David Ricardo insight, that has to do with what are countries able to produce at the lowest opportunity cost. If they specialize in the goods and services, producing those goods and services where they have the lowest opportunity cost, they'll be able to use their resources as efficiently as possible. They can create a surplus from what they are producing and then trade what they don't need. And that way they'll be able to consume beyond their PPF, that production possibilities frontier, and it leads to an increase in total surplus. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, when you add those together, total surplus. So there's lots of benefits from free trade, but don't take it from me. Let's go ahead and take a look at what those benefits are. Keep in mind there are also things that are problematic with trade, and we'll discuss that in more detail while your book discusses it. Here I want to explain a little bit about why free trade is beneficial. Remember our total surplus analysis, that was chapter 4. Here, if we look at price of phones, quantity of phones, a domestic demand curve, and a domestic supply curve, remember this is the most efficient outcome because we're maximizing our consumer surplus and producer surplus, getting the biggest total surplus we can get. And this is when countries are not trading. Let's say they're just having free market and letting the market work within their own country. But what if we knew that this price of phones, for example, is actually higher than what the price of phones would be if we bought this phone from another country? And that means an import, something that's produced in another country that U.S. consumers are buying here. Let's take a look at what that would look like. So there's a lot going on, but don't be afraid. It's our same domestic demand and domestic supply curves. There was the original price, that was our domestic price. But what if we now knew that the PW, the world price, was lower? Another country is able to, with their resources, produce phones at a lower opportunity cost and charge a lower price. Wouldn't U.S. consumers want to buy those phones? Yes, they would. So this would be the price, PW, that would prevail if we allowed for trade. And that's an import. So what that means is, at that price, U.S. suppliers, read off the supply curve, would only supply QS. That's the domestic amount of phones being supplied. But U.S. demanders at that world price would demand way out here based on their demand curve. That would be the quantity U.S. consumers would demand. In the past, when quantity demanded was greater than quantity supplied, that was excess demand or shortage, but now that can be filled with imports. So what we'll see is that there is a large increase in consumer surplus as a result. Consumers can buy phones that they want at a lower price and buy more of them. So take a look over here. Consumer surplus, what's happened when we allowed for imports? They have had a gain in their surplus of X plus Z. Do you see it over here on this graph? X plus Z. Their consumer surplus used to be W, now it's X plus Z. What happened to U.S. producers? They are hurt, and that's why they don't like imports. That's why we have the washing machine manufacturers in the U.S. and the steel producers clamoring for protection. When cheaper imports flood the market, consumers, U.S. consumers, will buy those imports. So you can see what happened with producer surplus. It shrank down to Y. What did they lose? They lost X. See it right here? Price went down, and they're selling less. But we want to look overall at the effect on the market of imports. And overall, when you add the positive gain from imports that consumers are feeling to the negative, the hurt that producers are feeling, there's still a net gain, a positive increase in total surplus of Z. So that's why most economists are for free trade. There's a recognition that it increases efficiency, that we can have more trades occur at a lower price. It can also work the other way with exports. What are exports? Goods that are produced here that are sold abroad. And you'll see that even though there is some hurt to consumers, there's more gain to producers. And I won't go through the effects of that because we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of these kind of graphs on your exams or assignments. I just wanted to show you the case for free trade. What happens is that there are reasons sometimes why free trade Just allowing for free flow of imports and exports doesn't always make sense. And that's what we're seeing. I'm not saying what's happening right now necessarily makes sense. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But let's understand what's happening. We're putting up trade barriers. We're creating reasons for there to be less imports. One of the ways to do that is a tariff. You've heard about the tariffs that the current administration has put on China and Europe, Mexico, Canada. What is it? It's a tax on imported goods or services. And you could do it two ways: by the unit of those goods and services, how many are coming, or by the value. And that's what we're doing. We're doing by the value. So we put, say, a 25% tax on steel, and then we look at the dollar value of the steel coming, and it's 25% of that. There could also be an import quota. That would restrict trade, and what does that do? It restricts the volume of the imported good or service. So you might say something like only 100 million tons of steel are allowed in. Let's focus on tariffs since that's what's going on. Your book goes through both. And we can look at a graph. So the graph might look a little funky. What is this? This is the effects of a tariff on when we allowed imports. So remember, here's our domestic supply curve, our domestic demand curve. When we allowed for imports, there was a world price that we allowed for, and it was lower than the price that was set in our market. What does a tariff do? It raises that price a bit. It puts a tax on that good or service. So let's call PT our tariff price. So here you can see a tariff raises the price of the imports from PW, that lower world price, to a higher tariff price. And it's going to cause imports to shrink, because when you raise the price of something, it means consumers want to buy less of it. So notice what happens when you go from price W to price of the tariff. You're moving back along this demand curve, the domestic demand curve, to reflect that consumers want less of that product. That's moving from Q2 to Q4. And there's also an effect that as you raise the price, more suppliers in the U.S. are now going to be willing to supply that good or service. So we move from Q1 to Q3. So the net effect is that it causes imports to fall. We had been at this large amount of imports, the difference between Q1 and Q2, and by putting a tariff on and raising the price, we're shrinking the amount of imports. It's going to be the difference between Q3 and Q4. That's what I've got here. There's also an effect. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, so government collects revenues, and it'll be the area of the box, kind of like we did with profits, where it's the height, which will be the tariff, times the length, which is the amount of imports. And we've heard a lot about this, that the government's making money off of this. The truth is that much of the increase in price gets passed along to consumers. So yes, the government's collecting tax revenue, but it's not, tariff revenue, but it's not necessarily that the foreign government, where we're importing from, China's paying it. It could be that consumers are paying that in a higher price. And as I've showed that the domestic producers are going to sell more at that higher price. So here's a graph of what we can predict will happen when we restrict trade by putting a barrier on trade, and in this case, a tariff. So in words, sometimes it's helpful to see it in a graph, and in words, what's happening? What's the economic impact? Well, the direct effects we saw is a decline in imports, right? It shrank the amount of imports because we raised the price. That caused a decrease in consumption. There are fewer consumers buying that good, that foreign good, but it did increase the domestic production, and it created some tariff revenue. What we can say, and we could go through the full-blown total surplus analysis, and your book doesn't do it, so we'll just set it aside, but let's just remind ourselves what it means when we say something's inefficient. What we're saying is that there are trades that would have occurred if we didn't interfere with the market. And so by putting a tariff, a tax on imports, it's artificially raising the price and restricting the amount that consumers want to buy. Those are trades that should have happened, could have happened, had there not have been a tariff. So we're creating deadweight loss by putting this tariff on. So that's a big effect with tariffs. Also, there's going to be price increases, and that could lead to some inflation. As we raise the price, that gets put into the whole supply chain. If the price of steel goes up, then presumably the price of making cars, trucks goes up, beer kegs goes up. And it can hurt the industries that use those imported goods in their supply chain. So we're seeing a lot of these secondary effects right now. And this might make you wonder, why do we then have tariffs, or why do we want to restrict trade? In your book, Chapter 16 goes through it in great detail very well. There are some legitimate reasons to be concerned about allowing for free trade. National security reasons. We don't want to become too reliant on a foreign produced good, because in times of war, or if we need to protect ourselves, we need to have an industry here to make those goods. We want to protect U.S. Producers and the people who work in that industry. That's legitimate. And then there's others, anti-dumping, infant industry. I'll let you read through those in the chapter, and then we'll have a chance to discuss them in the discussion posts. For now, that's all I want to say on tariffs and trade. So good luck with the next step. Thanks.